problem with developing countries as it currently stands, and the reason why they continue to struggle to do well within the world, the reason why they struggle to develop properly, is because they're necessarily holding back half the population. Half the population can't thrive within that country, so that country can't ever develop or move on in the same way. When half of the population can't participate in that country in any meaningful way, but also for the women who live within those countries, they necessarily become trapped because there's no means for them to ever get out of poverty traps. There's no way for them to ever become better in and of themselves. I'm going to look at three things. Firstly, I'm going to look at sexism within these societies and the harm that it causes to society and the women themselves. Secondly, I'm going to look at how, when we do enact this policy, it gives those women in those societies a certain amount of power on an individual basis. And then thirdly, we're going to look at how this policy benefits the wider communities in which those women live as a whole. Firstly, in terms of model, we say that these loans will be given out similarly to the way in which they already are. Presumably, you'll have to have things like a solid business plan, etc. The difference is only women get them, men obviously don't get them. Is that clear? Yeah. Is that a clarification? Okay, cool. Okay, so firstly, how sexism is a major problem within these societies and is holding women back. The problem within these societies is you have systemic barriers to women in terms of doing well and being able to participate within society in any meaningful way. When we view those women solely as wives, as mothers, as vessels to carry our children, as things we can utilise for our own pleasure, we don't see those women as having a place within our society. We don't see how they can engage within that society in any meaningful way. We think by enacting this policy, we think the reason why women can't engage with that community in any meaningful way is because men exclusively control that society in a way they don't necessarily anymore in developing countries. But when you see things like the governments, particularly have men in power, when you see in tribal regions, the men are patriarchal figures within those societies. We think by giving out these loans, it necessarily changes that, in that these businesses and enterprises are an economic necessity within those communities. We say that those communities want to go on and do better, and they necessarily need that kind of development to do better. We say that when we give that power and vest that power exclusively in women, we provide a paradigm through which they can engage in that culture for the first time in a meaningful way, and we now can offset those women into a position of power, and for the first time visualize them being in power. Firstly, how that power enables women to do things. Firstly, when you see women in positions of power and when you see them in positions of authority, first of all, your perception of that woman as a human being, but also your perception of that woman as a role within society ultimately changes, because for the first time you see her as being something that's useful in contributing towards that economy. So you're less likely to look at her solely as a wife, solely as a vessel for carrying your child. You're more likely to see her as being in some way useful to contributing to society, in way we saw women being viewed as useful to society for the first time during World War II, when they engaged in economic work for the first time. We think when you change the perception of women within that society, you're more likely to allow them to access positions of power in that society. Why is those positions of power useful? First time, we say that money and finance and the ability to act autonomously for those women gives those women a certain amount of power, in that they can now access choices and things that they want for the first time. They can do things they want for themselves. They can buy their own products. They can choose where they want to live. They can move about in the same way they necessarily couldn't when they were controlled by their husbands. So that means that they can act autonomously. It also means that when they have that autonomy and agency in the way that they didn't have before, it means they can do things like leave abusive relationships, because they now have the money to go on and move out somewhere else. They can set up on their own. So they're less likely to feel the need to stay in those kind of relationships, or they're less likely to seek those relationships or have their families sell them into those relationships, because they're not financially dependent on that union in the same way that they would have been before. I'll take closing now.
So we agree with a lot of that, and we think that under the status quo, lots of women do get microfinance loans. Your burden is to prove why a man who is oppressed because of his caste or sexuality is never deserving of assistance.
Okay, we say that the reason why we'll necessarily discriminate against those people over women is because we say that those those people within that society can still participate within that society in a slightly more meaningful way than a woman ever can. We say that, like, firstly, women take up like 50% of that community, as opposed to like the smaller minority of men within the community. So in a purely utilitarian basis, it's better. We say also for those men who are discriminated in that way, we say it's still easier for them to access things. They still benefit from male privilege in a way that women never can. Secondly, how this benefits communities. So, like, firstly, when you see those women in positions of power, when you see them like running industries, when you see them being beneficial to that community, it elevates the place of women within the community. It also means, like, secondly, that those women are necessarily more likely to employ other females within that community. Why? Because if we look at the way in which people currently continue to employ people, we notice that we always pick people that are most like to us. That's why, like, male CAOs are more likely to employ males. So those women are more likely to employ women that can do things, but also they're more likely to employ a female employee in a way in which a man never could, because those women don't necessarily have the same, like, misogynistic biases that a man would. So they're more likely to hire more females. So more females within that community can now benefit from having that industry or that business within that community. So now they get elevated into positions of power. So now we see more females within that community elevated into positions of power and being active within that community. Like, thirdly, it also means that females are more likely to set up businesses and industries that will benefit, like, exclusively females within that community in a way in which men don't necessarily, like, have the incentive to do. So they're more likely to set up things like maternity hospitals for those women. They're more likely to set up things like sexual aid clinics. They're more likely to do things like set up like things that benefit women in terms of like clean like places to like mind their children or clean supplies, in a way that men don't necessarily like see those needs of women or care about those needs of women. So it means that those needs are now catered for. So for all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Madam Speaker, we actually agree with plenty of what the Prime Minister said, right? But before I explain in what ways we agree, let me outline the case that I'm going to present to you. First, I'm going to talk about why broader economic empowerment is actually better for female empowerment, right? And I'm going to talk to you about why, that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing is how actually this policy justifies the unequal treatment of women. And finally, I'm going to talk about backlash and why this is particularly problematic for the tool of female empowerment that they like to talk about, right? Because when there's likely to be backlash from men who tend to hold the political power, then you simply do not have the investment in infrastructure that you need in order for business to succeed, right? But before that, on the Prime Minister's speech, we agree that women getting microfinance loans is particularly important, particularly useful, right? And that's why in places like India, in Bangladesh, and Pakistan, most of the people who do get microfinance loans are women, right? And we think, Madam Speaker, to the extent that that's true, we're happy to go with that, right? And it's unclear where in her case she proves that it needs to be purely, these loans need to be purely extended to women, right? We think that's pretty problematic for their case, and we think that the Deputy Prime Minister needs to come back and explain to us why that is. I'm going to explain to you why it's problematic to make it exclusive to women. Because we think that broader economic empowerment is better for female empowerment, right? And the narrow economic empowerment you have as a consequence of this policy is bad in two ways, right? It's bad for broader economic empowerment because first it leads to slower overall economic growth, right? Firstly, right? And trivially it leads to narrower economic empowerment, right? Let's talk about slower overall economic growth, right? Because we think as a consequence of this, the best entrepreneurs, in particular the best male entrepreneurs who might be able to successfully set up businesses, right, aren't going to get any funding as a consequence of this, right? And we think that there are going to be many good male entrepreneurs who won't get funding as a consequence, right? And we think that means that if, on the other hand, on the status quo, when the best male entrepreneurs have access to this funding, right, they can contribute to more economic activity in their societies, right, in particular, successful and sustainable economic activity. And that's massively useful for these societies because entrepreneurship is one of the keys to strong, sustainable, and successful economic growth, right? We think that you're depriving the country of a powerful source of economic growth by taking away microfinance loans from poor men, right? And we think while they might not buy the idea that poor men can become economically successful from microfinance loans, we would point out that many incredibly rich billionaires in the third world, like the Philippines, for example, started out as shoe salesmen, right? So that actually happens, right? So the second problem here is that only women get economic empowerment, right? That's obvious. So why is this bad for the empowerment of women? We think that economic growth and development is strongly correlated with female empowerment. And we think, in fact, that strong, sustainable, and successful economic growth is, in fact, the best way of achieving female empowerment. Because we think that being richer tends to make people more progressive. And that happens in two ways, right? Firstly, the first way is that when you're richer, you tend to be better educated, you tend to be much more likely to be exposed to Western values, right? Because you're much more likely to travel to the West or watch Western TV shows, right? So you're much more likely to be exposed to and to internalize and appreciate progressive Western values that will make you more amenable to advocating and respecting the rights of women and advocating the empowerment of women, right? This might not seem like a big thing, right? But we think that it's massively important. That's why the rise of televisions in rural India was actually associated with a strong decrease in domestic violence against women. Because the rise of TV shows actually did show that did give rural Western men access to Western TV shows that allowed them to internalize these Western values, and that's massively useful, right? The second way in which it is useful, is that the better position men are in, the more amenable they are to giving rights to women. And even in so far as your policy only allocates economic power to women and not political power, right? Because we think men will still hold all the political power, right? They're not going to be giving up political rights to these women, and that's particularly problematic for them, right? Yep, fine.
Okay, so most of these industries are already controlled by men, or if we're going to start up these industries, it's more likely that men will start them up. By exclusively only allowing women to set these up, you provide a counter-narrative where you now allow more women to break into that market.
First of all, that's not true. I already explained to you why most microfinance loans are already granted to women. Right? So we think that women already do benefit a lot from these microfinance loans and already benefit to the extent that it's useful, because if there were more women who had great business ideas, the money is usually prioritized to go to them, right? So the likely consequence is you're giving money to women who don't have a solid business ideas and are likely to fail and are likely to get themselves even further in debt, right? So the second thing here is how this justifies unequal treatment of women, right? Because obviously this justifies unequal treatment of women in two ways. Because we think that when talking about people who are actually already somewhat misogynist, and there are plenty of these in these countries, as the Prime Minister points out, right? These people will actually feel more justified in their misogyny, Madam Speaker, because these women are starting to better themselves as a consequence of this policy. But we say, secondly, we think that you are forcing them to reassert their superiority, right? Because you're creating cognitive dissonance in the minds of these men that they view themselves as superior, but then this woman is doing better economically than they are, right? This gives them this is a problem for them, and this will force them to reassert their superiority. We would point out that now, given that they are now not superior in economic sense, they're probably likely to reassert themselves in means like violence or physical superiority, and we think that's dangerous for these women, right? The last argument is short but important, right? when men still hold all the political power and men aren't benefiting from small entrepreneurship, right? There just simply is no clout for the development of infrastructure that these microfinance businesses need, right? Microfinance needs roads or what have you for the businesses behind them to succeed, right? We need men to advocate for the building of roads and plumbing in these poor communities, and we do not have that if only women have access to these loans. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Three things in extending side proposition today. Okay. Firstly, I'm going to be looking at the unique role and unique status of women, particularly in developing countries. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about diversity within the economy, why I feel it's good, why I feel it's enhanced on our side. And lastly, I'm going to be looking at the political system and advantages we feel for that in direct clash to what we just heard. Firstly, loads and loads of rebuttal. Okay, so we said that a country's greatest resource is its people. A point that Niamh raised and wasn't dealt with and engaged with at all. An economy and ultimately a society as a whole thrives on people's individual talent and intelligence and perseverance. None of, at the point at which a country is alienating 50% of its workforce from this. That's why women are unique, you'll notice. Because men from a particular caste, men from a particular sexuality or ethnicity are nowhere near make up that large proportion of the population. Also easier for them, you'll notice, to hide whichever particular factors prevent them from exercising their economic agency. Not something obviously that's usually okay for a woman to do. So we say in that case, the economic empowerment is massively helped on our side, because you are essentially doubling the pool of talent, doubling the chance of having successful entrepreneurs, doubling the chance of having successful talent from people. They tell us and try and portray us as a choice of either we get worse entrepreneurs on our side. Okay, they have literally given us no analysis as to why, if we are giving to women, because women are likely to be worse entrepreneurs than men. We want some strong bit of analysis as to why that happens. This idea that men won't get funding. Okay, several things on this. One, we point out that men are in a better place to economically contribute to society anyway by virtue of the fact that they live in patriarchal systems. Okay, thank you. Secondly, again, didn't engage with why that outweighs the fact that now, potentially, as Niamh tells you, by promoting the view that women are active economic agents, you get massively more economic pool of labour to draw on. Thirdly, we say thirdly on this idea that when men become richer, then women do better. Okay, several issues with this. One, see the vast number of cases where that hasn't happened. See the Gulf states. He brought up India as an example. At the point at which you're using India as an example of women's rights, we think you're in trouble. Okay, we our counter-analysis as to why this is not true is that you are still formed by the lens of your culture, and you still see things through the lens of your culture, no matter what heights you've risen to. In fact, what that vindicates for you is that actually I'm right. Actually, I deserve this. Actually, in my talent, I've accrued this money and I deserve the position of authority in which I find myself. This idea that, you force men to reassert their dominance. Note that this is an argument against women, giving women any kind of help or any kind of advice ever at all, because it drives women, it drives men to counteract them. Also see the fact that everything Niamh tells you about how this allows women to act autonomously from men. Even at the point, we recognise there's a degree to which they can say, they'll exert forces within a family, that happens anyway. At this point, you are in a better position to seek legal aid. You're in a better position to seek contacts. So you are financially more autonomous, so less dependent on the community. Okay, that was a lot. Moving on, diversity. Diversity within the economy. Okay, we say that we think we see women beginning to play a much larger role in the country. Benefits of this. One, as we said earlier, you just get more women. You just get more talent, and therefore, we think that when you are drawing from a larger pool, you get better, ultimately, a better standard of worker. By the way, they tried to tell us at the end, you'll be getting these shoddy business plans. We told you, we're going to carefully scrutinise these things. That's all in the model. Look there. Okay, another advantage of diversity in the economy is we think diversity is a good thing in general because people's opinions are formed by particular experiences with which they undergo. And women obviously have drastically different experiences to men. At the point at which you have people coming in with all the same background, with similar ideas to a degree, yes, that's an argument for for making poor men more active. We think that'd be good too. As Niamh told you, we say it's ultimately only a finite amount of aid, ultimately only a finite amount of resources we can distribute. We said the game we stand to get here is much better because now we don't have as much of an echo chamber. Now we have more different ideas and all that kind of thing. You get a reorientation of the economy away from patriarchal norms, as Niamh tells you, because firstly, now there's an increased perception of women as autonomous, independent economic agents, people you can market to. It's now acceptable to target economic activity towards women's concerns and women's issues. Secondly, but the same thing but different analysis, you have now women in controlling positions of authority in these companies. They obviously understand these issues to a greater degree, so you get again a reorientation that benefits women as a whole. No thanks. Okay, so let's talk about women and why you feel women are absolutely unique. Before I do, I'll take opening, yeah?
How are these businesses going to succeed if there are no men lobbying for infrastructure in these rural areas where these microfinance loans are mostly made?
Okay, so we think it unlikely, firstly, that absolutely zero men will be willing to engage with this to any kind of degree. Okay, we think that at the point at which you can prove strong profit, that you can prove significant economic gain, at the point at which you have Western resources and Western intelligence backing you, as we assume, given the case the world we're getting loans, we presumably want some kind of return. These charities will help them out. That's a direct incentive there. Thirdly, we think it's perfectly possible for a potential idea to get off the ground, even with only women backing it, if it's good enough in and of itself and if it actually addresses a need. We think that's a definite benefit on our side of the house. Furthermore, we still say, even if it doesn't massively accrue, it's still better than the status quo. Okay, so at the moment, women often find themselves in insular communities. And the problem is they are dependent on those communities for their material well-being and their resources. That gives these communities a massive tool which to coerce them into following societal norms and patriarchal norms. See female genital mutilation, see child marriage, see all those things. At the point at which now you actively improve the status of women, as we said earlier, you allow them to break free from the society and break free from community, because money is ultimately the supreme actor of agency in terms of a person. But also, by putting women in better positions of authority and more positions of authority, firstly, you then allow them to invest that money, because money breeds money and money breeds power, to invest it in programs which ultimately help women and help females, female education, female healthcare, as Niamh said. Also, by presumably these businesses will employ some men to a degree. At the point at which you begin to see that as more normal, that forces you to challenge, forces you to confront your ideas of normal gender relations in a way that you never get at the point at which you live only within your own society. Well, that's never harm. They tell us, you don't get change on political side. What we say to that is that ultimately politicians are cynical and greedy to a degree. At the point at which they stand to gain materially from seeing this kind of improvement, we don't think they're necessarily going to shut out women to a massive degree if they stand to gain financially. Also note that politicians tend to depend to a large degree on Western support and Western backing. Western countries obviously place a high degree of value on women. At the point at which you can uphold the fact that your country has a strong female industry and has strong female participation, that's a massive bargaining tool and a massive status symbol for you to use in your negotiations with the West. We are very proud to propose.
Madam Speaker, we think that this round is not a clash between those who feel that we should give loans to women and those who feel that we should not. We think the clash in this round is between a world where we exclusively give these loans to women and a world where we give them to women, maybe even preference women in them and other disenfranchised groups, but where we nevertheless attempt to fight inequality wherever we find it by using the tools available. We also have a clash here between people's views that the only thing that matters in microfinance is the money you initially give, and those on our side who believe that one of the big increases is how you jumpstart an economy with it, and how, in their words, it's the economic change that tends to shift people's worth from what their background is to what they can do, that eventually liberates not just women, but gays and lesbians and racial and religious minorities in countries around the world. Because as they say, everyone wants money. I'd like to begin with a little bit of rebuttal. The first thing we hear from them is something that's a truism. It is that a country thrives on its people. We have three responses to this. The first is that we agree absolutely that it thrives on its people. We in fact think that self-interest is going to be the drive, is one of the most powerful forces. And we think that's why, as I'll explain, it's the most important thing that we tie to our wagon of equality so that we can push forward with it. We think that what they give us here is a compelling case, a well-argued case, but it's a well-argued and compelling case for giving microfinance loans to women and maybe for preferencing them. At no point do we get a case for why not to give necessarily to men other than that you have an absolutely finite amount of money. At the point at which we have Western aid, we're going to say that we think we should be doing more of that, but we're still in the area where we have microfinance going to argue that we get more efficiency by doing that. Why is that? Because we get a challenge from them where they challenge our view that economic growth in of itself is good. They give us two things. First, they tell us that these cultures are too inflexible, that somehow misogyny and racism are in the people's genes. We think we can see that, actually proof against that, even if you look at Europe, which was a very misogynist place even 50 years ago, and was even more misogynist 100 and 150. In fact, when you look at Europe, not only has it fought for women's equality, but women's equality movements took off in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, Western economies chose to take off. And we increasingly see the same thing in the developing world, where the countries that have been most economically successful have been the most open to electing women as presidents. South Korea is a good example of this. One of the most misogynist countries culturally half a century ago has a female president today. We think that that is a sign. But secondly, outside of their cultural thing, they say that, why do you get a broader thing here? We say that the reason we get, why do you think this is better? Well, first of all, we think that we're cutting off half the people from investing. We're not saying that men are better. We think of the top 100 entrepreneurs, 95 will be women. But if you give out 100 spots exclusively to women, you are still excluding 5 of the potentially best entrepreneurs. And why is this a problem? And where because we think that the amount you give in microfinance is fundamentally limited, both because you have a limited amount of money and because these loans are small. As my partner pointed out, these are things to start your own shoe store or something like that. The real impact you get is from multipliers. When people sell a lot of shoes and raise enough money to open a second shoe store and hire other people. And when you get enough economic power that you can lobby politicians who may be misogynist, but also very much like money, and perhaps bribe them to build you the roads and electricity that you need to build a shoe factory and get to market. We think that in that sense, you need this multiplier effect, which you get much more the better entrepreneurs. We think there's a second reason for this, because we think economic growth produces equality. And we think we saw this in Europe. And one of the reasons for that is that women are disadvantaged in careers that value physical labor. So when we look at the advancement of women, it's happened in 2 cases. One, in instances of labor shortages. We'll borrow their example of the Second World War from that. When there weren't enough men, so women got drafted into working in factories and ended up proving they could do a good job. And secondly, in the area, is that my 5 minutes? Okay. And secondly, we think the other way is when education and things in your mind and what you can do becomes more important than what you can lift. We think both of those are caused by economic growth. Economic growth produces labor shortages where you need to employ everyone, and where locking women into the harem costs misogynist noblemen and Arab princes money. We think the reason why you can be misogynist Saudi Arabia is if your money comes out of the ground and you have slavery, you're not losing half your workforce. But we think if you have an industrial economy, you can't lock half your workforce in harems, even if you're the most misogynist person on the planet. And that's why we think this is good. We hear stuff from them on how diversity is good. Yes, we agree. We think the more diversity you have across gender, gender identification, sexuality, and racial and religious grounds is better. And then they argue that women can necessarily lobby regardless. We think that's true, but we think it's easier for women to lobby when, for instance, they own their own businesses. And we see this even in countries like India, than we think it is for them to lobby when they can't vote and don't have other stuff. And we think it's even better when men stand to make profit off of the advancement of women's rights. I'll take closing.
Okay, so if it is true that the majority of microfinance loans already go to women, then why does raising it to all women so damage economic growth that our benefits just like don't stop.
Because presumably the reason we're giving some to men now is because those men have better applications. So we moving the money from people who can perhaps get a 10% a year growth to people who can only get a 5% a year growth, and we think that that would greatly hurt the economy. But we think on a wider level, it is a little bit simple to say that discrimination begins and ends with women. We think that when we look at these societies, we find that discrimination is all throughout it. We see this with racial and religious minorities like Muslims in Burma. We see this with gays and lesbians throughout the world. And we think in some cases this is even worse because everyone is the child of a man and woman, which means the historical and generational succession interact. But if you're a minority group, either religious or otherwise, you have generations of discrimination that have made you poor because people have come in and burnt down your farm and burnt down the stuff you have. If you're gay or lesbian, you are cut off from your family and their influence and their wealth. And we think that these people are not necessarily more worthy than women, but we think individually they might be more so than the prince, than the wife of an Arab sheikh. And we think that they deserve to have the most, to have just as much, at least a look and application. If we had a specific charity that tried to focus on, say, gay businessmen in the developing world, that would be banned under their mechanism because we couldn't give microfinance loans to them. And even if people were willing to separately donate money that wouldn't otherwise exist. And we think that's wrong. We proudly oppose.
So we think First Prop give you a lot of benefits like of having female business owners. What we think is really important in this debate is the exact character of the kinds of barriers that women currently face in terms of accessing positions of economic privilege in the developing world. So we want to like mainly focus on that in our extension. I'm going to look at two things. Firstly, like basically what I just said there, like the exact character of those barriers and like why this mechanism specifically, why it has to be all women, not just mostly women, it is the best way to tackle this. And then secondly, I want to talk about like why bringing like more female experience to like entrepreneurship is really important, not in an essentialist way, but just in terms of the fact that women just generally have incredibly separate lived experience to men. So like just before that quickly, like in terms of the POI response, like they say that like, oh, presumably if like the five men were offering the microfinance to have really good ideas, but like that's not necessarily true. Like we point you to the fact that the people offering the microfinances can be sexist too and also have inbuilt biases, right? So like we don't necessarily think that's true. Like secondly, in terms like comparatively, like the comparative here is slightly slower economic growth versus all the benefits that we bring. So we don't think that stands. Okay, let's talk about let's talk about like the character of these barriers. So firstly, right, like we'd say like in the developing world, like even still in the Western world to some extent, there's the perception of women of being helpless and like or being caregivers, and that's like what they should do in life, right? Like that affects them in two ways, both in terms of like affects their own perceptions of what they can do in life, but even insofar as they are able to break out of that, like other people have those perceptions and are more likely to hold them down. Secondly, though, we say women suffer from like a lack of access to education, right? They don't, and that's important insofar as they don't, like even if you can get to the point where they can get microfinance loans, like they just don't have the know-how to actually start businesses. Thirdly, like even if you get over that, like if you look at in the developing world, like huge amounts of those industries focused around like heavy manual labor, focused around extraction of specific resources, right? And it's incredibly difficult for women to get into that kind of industry, at all, right? So we point you to that like one of the only like avenues open to women to actually like empower themselves is to start a business. Fourthly, though, fourthly though, like we point you to the fact that like even in terms of women who are able to get over all that, like it's just the fact that like men, even in the developing world, tend to have more contacts, tend to be able to persuade people to collaborate with them a lot more, so they're again more shut out from the process. Like specifically, why does this policy help? Why does this have to be all women, right? Like we'd say like those perceptions exceptions, even if they still exist, can no longer be used to hold women out, like hold women back in terms of applying for microfinance, right? Like we'd say, like when women get to that point, they can now apply. Like they say they can apply now, but like no getting to the point of actually applying for microfinance, like you presumably would have to go through like quite a strong route before you're actually at that point. And like we think typically this is where women are held back, right? So like you still don't get a lot of women actually being able to have access to these loans, and we think that changes when like necessarily they're the only one that can have access to these loans. But secondly, right, like insofar as starting businesses is a great way to improve the position of these women, you massively incentivize families like who, because of limited resources or other cultural conceptions, you massively incentivize these people to educate their women, right? Insofar as that these are the people who can now actually start businesses more easily and get you out of that. No, thank you. Which we also think is very important. Like, and that incentive only implies if it is all women, right? Because of all the other resistance that exists to educating women anyway. So that's why it has to be women. No, thank you. Like in terms of like the stuff we get about like harming men from top half, right? Like we'd say it's comparatively we care more about women, but more importantly we'd say the incentive of like now the poor budding entrepreneur, like it's not like he just like now can't have like any interaction with business whatsoever. Like it's not like all businesses have to be like entirely female employees. The incentive is for that person to like share their idea with a woman, so that woman then applies with that idea. Like he probably wouldn't have as high a position like as he would in the status quo, like as the business owner, but he still like massively improves his position like from poverty if he shares that idea with a woman. So it's not true that you are excluding men from the process. You're just privileging women much more, which we think is very important, right? Yeah. So you're just privileging women much more, and that also means, right, that all the stuff like first off talk about like advocating for like increased infrastructure and roads, etc. Like you still have men who do that. Like collaboration can still happen. And in terms of the stuff that back half are looking at in terms of in terms of like lower like caste or sexuality, like we think like firstly like women in those situations like of low caste or sexuality are comparatively more oppressed, so we should look to them. But moreover, again, the incentive is still like to like as I said earlier to share the idea with a woman. I'll take a PY from closing.
Okay, so lots of your benefits already accrue under the status quo. How do you think communities in the worst of communities are going to react to what will be seen as a Western plot to engage in the feminist engineering of that society?
Like as in insofar as those communities like already don't educate women and already like deny all rights to women, I don't think a huge amount of change, except insofar as you'll probably motivate individual families within those communities to try and educate their women, which we think is a good way of getting them out of that. Finally, then in terms of like why we want to in terms of like an extra benefit to this policy, like beyond like mechanistically why it works, like we think like bringing so we think like women have like fundamentally different like lived experiences to men, right? Based upon like the specific experiences, like especially in the developing world, of like different kinds of expectations, different kinds of lives, like experience, like expectations to be a caregiver, etc. Like insofar as like some women get through like in the developing world to start businesses now, like they very much have to conform to men's expectations in order to do that, right? So like you're less likely to see that different kind of like lived experience coming out of it. Like we'd say like the reason why that different lived experience is important, right, is it leads to different kinds of innovation, right? Women starting different kinds of businesses to what men start, insofar as like men typically tend to insofar as those economies are dominated by manual labor, like those are probably the kinds of business that men tend towards more, whereas we think like women like generally just do think differently. They have a different experience to men, so they can bring that. So because it has to be like only women in order for the mechanism to work, and because because of all the benefits to women having access to positions of economic power and privilege, we're really happy to propose.
For that speech, and now call on the opposition member.
when the Indian federal government imposed quotas on the basis of gender and on caste membership on local village councils in rural India in the early 1990s, the backlash was incredible. The people who were elected to the reserve positions on those village councils were attacked. In many cases, they were murdered. That was a response to the central government of that country imposing a challenge to the power norms that those communities have become accustomed to. When that challenge is coming from the West, from the ex-colonial power, we think that backlash is likely to be so much worse, and that level of violence and extremism just outweighs the economic benefits that have been talked about in the opening half of this debate. Three things in extension with some rebuttal interwoven. Firstly, why do only women deserve help? Secondly, will women in fact be helped by this? Thirdly, how will communities in these countries react? Before that, briefly, some rebuttal that doesn't quite fit in. So, stuff from the opening half that we feel is broadly dealt with by opening up, where they talk about we can double the productivity by giving all the women jobs, and we can get diversity in the economy. The key thing here is that it is just true that most microfinance loans at the moment go to women. I know there's this debating nonsense where you have to provide analysis. It's just a fact. Gram Bank in Bangladesh delivers loans, take a seat, to women and groups of women who form associations in order to apply for those loans with business plans. That's how these loans work. Because of some of the stuff that they talk about, right? Because men are more able to access traditional finance. Because that's where microfinance already targets their loans. But they don't have to do that with an explicit policy that says, what we're going to do is challenge the patriarchal norms that these societies have, challenge the traditional values of those societies. So we don't think the benefit they get is so massive anyway, because you already get a lot of the stuff they talk about from giving loans to women, but you make it much worse by putting that explicit label on it. Secondly, in explicit rebuttal, some of the stuff out of their extension. What they say is women specifically are shut out from the ordinary labour economy and so need to be able to start their own businesses. We'd say a couple of things. Firstly, that's true. So are many oppressed men. Many men are just unable to get work in the ordinary economy and need these kinds of loans in order to have any economic livelihood whatsoever. No thanks. More on that later. Secondly, as I just said, women can and do start businesses with the help of these loans in the status quo, so that's not a unique benefit to their side. Thirdly, though, we say, as our opening tell you, that the businesses started by men also help the economy, also provide vital goods and services to local communities, and we don't think that's something you can just wave off by the fact that they benefit from male privilege. Okay, so, into extension. Why do only women deserve help? No thanks. Because what we hear at Prime Minister is that women face systemic barriers. It was very vague. They didn't tell us really what those systemic barriers were, but they were broadly reasonable. But the problem is that they're not the only people who face systemic barriers, right? It never helps. Being a woman and gay, or being a woman and a Dalit, that's ex-untouchable, and gay, is worse than being a man in those things. But a Dalit man or a gay man in rural North India or Bangladesh who isn't allowed to work in his village because the village council imposes a boycott with tribal sanctions on that person, on people who interact with that person, is in desperate need of a loan, is in desperate need of capital to allow them to do anything, in just the same way that women are for some of the reasons that they have. So a gay man, a Tibetan, someone from the Uyghur minority in China are in just as much need because they're just as systematically excluded as women in the ways that they talk about. So our principle here is that you should allocate these loans on the basis of need, the ability of people to find other work and engage with the economy in other ways, and on the basis of viability. So not to a woman in a rural area to start a business which nobody will buy from at the risk of being boycotted by that village's leaders. Importantly, though, we think that this also means that in areas where women aren't empowered to access loans, something we're going to talk about in a moment, you get no loans at all. In villages where the women aren't in a position to get these loans, aren't allowed to apply for loans by the elders and rulers of those villages and communities, you don't get any money. You don't get any of those economic benefits. Those areas stagnate, and that's terrible. We think it is unfair and incredibly harmful to allocate these loans only to women. Okay, secondly, will women in fact be helped by this? No thanks. Some women will be. Generally, though, it will be the better off women. Why is that? Because some women will just never get these loans. Women in rural areas will face the risk of boycotts, like I've just talked about, or violence against them if they apply for these loans and get these loans and try to start businesses without the approval of the leaders of those villages and the particular patriarchal structures that they want to talk about. So that means you might get these loans if you're from a dominant caste or a dominant tribe and you're the wife of one of the people on this kind of council. But if you're not one of those people, then you as a woman are left behind. So it's not enough for Gov member to go we should look to those people. We should look to those women who are from low caste. They're never going to get these. They're never going to be allowed to apply for them at the risk of incredible violence and harm to themselves. Other women who will get them under the control of men, because your husband or village or community won't let you apply unless you're applying as a front for your husband. This is already something that we see with land ownership laws in India. Women are listed as owning land, which in fact is effectively controlled by their husbands. No, thank you. We think that's much more likely now, because the only way that men can access these loans is by using their wives as a front, by using their wives to apply in order to get that money. That's incredibly bad. It hurts women by securing that sense of patriarchal control over every aspect of their life. Also, though, it seems to help them when in fact it is not giving any help at all. Why is that comparatively so much worse than the status quo? A, because it exacerbates incredible gaps. You don't help people from minority tribes, from lower caste groups. They get left further behind and suffer even more economic exploitation and oppression than they already do. I'll take closing in a moment. But secondly, you give a false impression. You go, we're giving loans to all these women, things are going great. That saps the political will to help women more. That means that the women who don't get these loans, the women who are worst off, are left behind and there's no will to help them. That's incredibly harmful. Closing.
Okay, so you're right, the majority of these loans go to women. That sounds an awful lot like a quota. Why isn't the backlash happening now?
Okay, because it's not explicitly targeted, A. B, that's a knife of like yourself and everything that your opening said when you rejected what we, like the true claims that we were bringing you. Thirdly, how communities in these countries react. They tell us we'll change stereotypes. Okay, there are lots of women leaders, or like chief ministers and opposition leaders and things in India already. So if that's the dynamic, then that's kind of already working. But the real issue here is that if they have the policy of NGOs and Western organisations to target on the basis of gender in order to challenge these local power structures, that's an explicit effort to push Western feminist ideas that's incredibly hated. In rural areas, that means an aggressive challenge to local norms, which means that you get women, like they were when they were put on patriarch councils by affirmative action, being killed, seen as Western puppets, seen as challenging the rightful order. We think that women being punitively raped and beaten and killed is way worse than any of the benefits that they get on Gov Bench. Secondly, though, trans people. This is not a small group. The Hijra in northeastern India and Bangladesh are a big group, a traditional identity. They're male to female transgender people. When the perception of those people is that they're benefiting from a change in their appearance and their identity in order to benefit from loans, their identity is seen as a fraud. That puts already incredibly marginalised groups at the risk of even more violence, and we think that's a reprehensible thing. Madam Speaker, this policy is a terrible idea that will make the people worse off, much more subject to violence, much more at risk of death. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that speech, and now invite the government whip to the floor.
Madam Speaker, I have two things to talk about. One, is it legit to give these loans only to women? And two, the stuff about backlash and poor communities and things like that we just got out of closing. First, though, I just want to deal with some contradictions and clarifications, right? So, like, the last speaker just asserted that Michael knifed without saying what he knifed when he clearly didn't knife. So first of all, I just want to clarify that. What he was saying was the council quota that they talked about as having a massive backlash, right? The fact that suddenly like 20 or 30% of women on council, of people on councils had to be women, like that there was massive backlash on that. That's a massive contradiction at the point where they say, it's fine guys, most microfinance loans only go to women anyway. Which kind of sounds like a quota to me, like a 75% quota. So what Michael was saying is that we're unclear why that backlash hasn't already happened, and that we're unclear why it gets so much worse when first ops say only like 5 or 10 men lose out. So we're unclear why the backlash is so crazy, and we obviously didn't knife. No, thank you. Secondly, the thing about the economy, and this is this thing again, like we keep pointing it out and they just keep ignoring it by saying that we keep pointing out that we're unclear why economic development is so much worse when only a few men lose out. No thank you. And their response to this is that the men who lose out are better entrepreneurs for some reason. We reject that out of hand. No thank you, because they say that they only choose men when they're better entrepreneurs, but the reason that they give literal quote is presumably, right? So presumably we think that it's quite likely that when you're deciding who to give a microfinance loan to, not only do you pick the person who has better education and better resources, which is more more likely to be a man in the developing world. No, thank you. But you also might have sexist hiring practices, like most Western people who control any kind of finance. No, thank you. So we reject that analysis out of hand. We don't think that's true, right? In terms of whether it's legit to give these loans only to women and whether that will help, right? Again, last speaker asserted massively that we said there were barriers to women and didn't say what those barriers were. No, thank you. Michael said 4, I think. Yeah, 4. Perception of women as caregivers and nothing else, education, lack of access to that it's difficult to get into the kind of industries like resource extraction and labour, and that men tend to have more resources like other than education, like familial ties, networking connections and things like that. Since they didn't listen to that, I just thought I'd repeat it just in case. Thank you. No, thank you. So essentially, no thank you, the analysis that Michael gives you, again, which is ignored because they didn't listen, is that this policy means that women can't be held back this way because not only do they know, but also their communities know that they need to be involved in business and entrepreneurship if that community is going to succeed. You incentivize families not only to educate their women, but to change things like their inheritance practices, to change things like who they introduce their daughters to, no thank you, to encourage women to start businesses because they know that the most important thing is economic growth. We reject out of hand that the most important thing to these communities is oppressing women. We think that the most important thing to these communities, no thank you, a lot of the time is making sure that their community develops. But the thing is, I am still on prop. I'm not just going to agree with you because you banged the table. The thing is, they don't just not think women are able because they're sexist. They don't think that women are able because again, I already said they don't have the same access to labour markets, no thank you, but the difference is on our side they now have access to a unique kind of market. Men know that the way to break into that market is to use their women. This makes women a more usable resource, which sounds horrible, but it's actually really good, no thank you. And particularly, this is kind of leading into my second point, the idea that they bring us in second half about excluding men who are also oppressed, right? So first of all, in areas of low caste or low income areas, Michael tells you, right? No thank you, first of all the women are worse off. Again, we don't think that that's necessarily a reason to completely screw over all the men in that area. But that's not what we're doing. We don't have to stand over that. We think that it's incredible that you now have an incredible incentive in these communities to collaborate with women and not screw them over even more than they already are from being born in that community in the first place. But we also think that no thank you, in terms of all their analysis about low income areas, right? We think that first of all, we're unsure that men in those areas have access to microfinance anyway. So we're unsure to what extent that this affects areas that are so isolated and women are so oppressed that this will just completely change things, right? But we think that again, to these areas, the most important thing is development, and the most important thing is making sure they use their resources correctly. Their incentives change at the point where they know that if I want to start a business, I need women on my side. Joint business ventures can happen on our side. They just have to have women leaders, which we say is incredibly important. I'll take opening.
How do you empower women fully when men refuse to give them political rights because of this policy?
Okay, so I just gave you quite a bit of analysis, I would say a lot of analysis, as to why men have an incentive to develop their community, right? So in terms of the politician stuff that you guys say that you'll have, for politicians will have less incentive to provide things like infrastructure. First of all, we don't think that's true because they want to develop their communities. Second of all, again, just gave you loads of analysis as to why men will get involved in these business ventures. Please listen to our extension. Secondly, more stuff about minorities and things like that, right? The stuff about backlash and why the West imposing this massive sweeping policy is really bad. First of all, this isn't a law, right? No thank you. This is NGOs exclusively offering certain types of loans to women. Why is there not as much backlash? Because men in these countries, as Michael tells you, already have more access to the kinds of loans that they can get from local banks. Women just don't. They completely overestimate the kind of backlash that will happen at the point where it's not the West literally coming in and imposing a law that only women can start businesses. That is a complete mischaracterization of this policy, and they're not going to get away with it, right? The idea that men will use women as fronts for businesses. On your side, you want those men to go for the microfinance anyway, so that's a wash at best, at the point where you say that the men will still be controlling the businesses. They control them on both sides, but the difference is at least it's more likely that the women will have access to the finance and have access to the business on our side, right? And then they say that like women in poor areas won't get them because they're afraid of the backlash and afraid of being boycotted and things like that. Like, first of all, as we already said, like we're unsure of like the effect of this policy that this has, because like poor isolated areas don't have as much access to microfinance anyway. But at the point where like again people see that like they must use women as a resource, and that like if there's and that if the reaction to this is just massive backlash against women, they get nothing out of it, right? So we think that the incentives change on our side, and moreover it's just more likely that that will happen. Okay, so like the comparative is better, right? We're so happy to propose.
What Fergus tells you in extension is that the patriarchal societies and the most patriarchal structures and communities in this debate, if they are as regimented as these guys say, then this policy is going to have limited efficacy at best. And indeed, in the worst case scenario, the very plausible worst case scenario that Fergus outlines to you, we will see fewer microfinance loans as there is resistance to what is seen to be a Western attempt to engineer and re-engineer those societies, and also that the most disadvantaged people are left behind as a false veneer of improvement is created when actually there is no advancement. That's what Fergus brings you in extension. That's what wins us this debate. 3 areas of clash. Firstly, and most extensively, I'm going to talk to you about female emancipation and how this policy doesn't achieve it. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about misogynist backlash. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about some development-based outcomes. So firstly, in terms of female emancipation, what Fergus tells you in extension is that it is unlikely that in the sorts of communities where women are the very worst off, if it is the case that that is because of deeply entrenched sexism, cultural sexism, that this policy is going to have little to no effect. These guys say there is now an incentive to train up women, to educate women, because those are the way in which you access these loans. No. Fergus says it is much more plausible that what is going to happen is that you will use women as a front in order to get those loans in these sorts of scenarios. This is bad because it creates a false veneer of improvement and advancement, because what that gives the perception of is that women are running businesses, therefore we don't need to provide other solutions, or there's less impetus to provide other solutions, when in fact it is men who are still running those businesses, only using women as a front. Secondly, these guys say that, well, we think that, their economic advancement is more important to them than oppressing women. What Fergus tells you in his speech is there is good reason to believe that these are values which stem from entrenched cultures in lots of instances. And what this will be perceived as is an attempt by Western NGOs to challenge and to break down and to remould those sorts of structures. We think as a result there will be enormous resistance to this, and your policy doesn't have an effect. The difference with the status quo, where these loans are allocated based on need and viability, is the one of perception, okay? And we say it's an important perception. We say the way in which you present your policy and the way in which you present these microfinance loans matters an awful lot in this debate. When they are seen as a way in which, the best entrepreneurs from a community can advance themselves and advance that community, that's much less likely to meet against the sort of backlash which you have when you explicitly say that they are a tool to female emancipation. That is a labelling that matters in this debate. No thank you. Secondly, we also think that in many scenarios, these loans just won't get in at all. It's unclear to us why it is a better outcome to have a very conservative community with a complete absence of a microfinance loan present and a microfinance business plan, which we think is what you get into this side of the house, than it is to have the same community with one of those loans going to a man who can potentially build up a business that will either improve the community economically or will be able to employ women. No thank you. Finally, in terms of alternatives and what are the sorts of outcomes that we suggest on our side of the house. We think what this is doing is providing a counterproductive solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. As Fergus outlines to you, it is just factually true that lots of these loans go to women in the first place. But the problem that is created by labelling this explicitly as an attempt and a way to achieve female emancipation is that you cut back, you get a backlash and get a cutting against of, I'll take opening in a moment, of the very worst elements of sex in society. Moreover, you don't improve the state of trans trans women, a point that Ferguson makes goes entirely unresponded to, as their identity is seen as an opportunistic way of attempting to gain income. They're a group who matter in this debate, they should have engaged with that. Go.
Okay, so you tell us that men will still control these businesses. We told you comparatively that women can now access money to allow them to leave communities, money to seek legal aid, authority due to having influential contacts, influential authority due to owning a business that brings benefits to the community. Surely, even if none of these work, it's still better off for most of the women.
No. Under the status quo, those things often already happen with the allocation of these loans. Our contention is the change that you are making and the loans which are now offered on your side of the house, i.e. those to the women in the very worst off communities, are not going to be effective in achieving those for all of the reasons which Fergus outlined. We think that they will either not be effective, they won't give them the sorts of benefits that you suggest accrue from this policy, because men will all either dictate the process of that loan and the process of building that business, or it will just be rejected entirely by that community. We say you don't achieve those outcomes for the group that you actually want to help. We say you actually impact upon the ability of those women to improve themselves, because, as Fergus outlined, you create a false veneer of improvement where there is one, where there isn't one, and you widen the gap in terms of, or widen the inequality gap between comparatively well-off and comparatively worse-off women. So, secondly then, no thank you. In terms of talking about misogynistic backlash, we talked about this already quite extensively in the first point. I realise I should have made them one big point, but that's grand. This is an explicit vindication of assumptions which already exist, okay? There is already worry surrounding these NGOs, and we accept that on our side of the house. These guys say, well, what you're proposing pretty much sounds like a quota. I mean, it is. No, it's not, okay? We're not advocating providing a quota. And as Fergus says, the sort of organic change that you get under our side of the house and under the status quo, the impact of that change is mitigated by the labelling and the surrounding rhetoric which comes around it. So, finally then, in terms of development-based outcomes, these guys say that a country's greatest resource is its people. I'll tell you why it was a bad thing for them to say after this. Yeah.
If women in a really, really bad communities currently don't apply for loans, then at worst nothing happens. But in other communities where they can, things change. So for the majority of women, things are better on our side. Please engage with that.
Okay, so in the first set of communities, those loans are not going to be applied for at all by women. Okay? Because you have to be in a certain position to be able to apply for that loan in the first place. There are reasons that you are not going to get that sort of advancement, which Fergus outlined. In the second set of scenarios, firstly what we say is that in lots of instances, those loans are already going to women. Secondly, we say there are potentially talented entrepreneurs, or more importantly, as Fergus outlines to you extensively, some of the very oppressed men in those communities, such as gay people, such as lower caste people, who are now completely left behind. And so comparatively, we don't think your benefit is sufficient to justify the impact which is had on the first set of outcomes, and also to justify the impact of the neglecting of those men who are oppressed and suggesting that their problems aren't significant. Finally then, in terms of these development-based outcomes, so these guys say the country's greatest resource is its people. We say this policy is just going to leave out potentially talented male entrepreneurs, okay? These guys say that, well, why don't you just assume that there will be talented male entrepreneurs? Evidence-based reasons, such as the existence of talented male entrepreneurs in the world, okay? These people now don't get in. It is unclear to us why an unsuccessful entrepreneurial enterprise started by a woman is a better way to achieve empowerment than a male-run successful business, okay? These guys say that the way in which men run businesses is really terrible and they just run in a really masculine way and they don't give opportunities to women. First of all, we say that's empirically untrue. If you build factories, women can work in it. But secondly, whilst it might be really nasty and whilst it is bad that women can't work in some of these industries, the products of those industries are necessary aids to the furthering the development of that country, as Fergus outlined. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very happy to give microfinance loans to women, very happy to give them to lots of women. We're not going to be happy to exclusively give them to women. For that reason, I'm very happy to oppose.